Greetings, and welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel. Today we're going to do just a fun little project making some stone planters. The backstory of this is I picked up a couple of really nice little alpine plants that I want to make a home for. And here in the humid east there's just so much vibrant growth that it's very difficult to make a rock garden for really small plants that doesn't just get weeded out. They're either miserable to maintain or your little diminutive plants get overgrown and wrecked by everything else around. So I want to raise them up above the ground and make some little planters for them. I wanted to use stone because it remembers the natural habitat of these sorts of plants growing in cliff sides and tops of mountains. And the idea, which kind of is the foundation for this, is the stone follies of British landscape architecture. Where this idea comes from, during the the Victorian era, the intelligentsia of England were very busy either conquering or visiting the whole rest of the world. They're out conquering all of these areas that have these ancient civilizations and ancient ruins, and they're visiting all over Europe and the former Roman Empire. And they're seeing these gardens built into ruins, built into ghost towns and ghost houses and ruins, right? They like them, and they come home and they're sad because they don't have any ruins of their own, so they build some fake ruins. And these were called follies. Okay? So that's kind of the inspiration for the idea here. We're going to make some little pots based on this idea of a stone folly. Now, as you're thinking through a project like this, all of the normal rules for building a stone wall still apply. Okay? It is gravity that holds masonry work together. Mortar is not glue, cement is not glue. Never has been, never will be. You have to think of your mortar and cement as a wedge which fills space and allows the friction of the rocks to be maximized. Okay? Yes, it has a little bit of adhesion, but that adhesion comes from the fact that these stones are irregular, and as the mortar is hardening, when it's soft, it gets into all of those irregularities, and then as it hardens, grabs them. But those are teeny tiny little tentacles of mortar sticking up into those irregularities that are very easily sheared off. Okay? So it's not glue. It does not form a chemical bond between the surfaces being mortared. It takes up space. So all of the rules in a full-scale wall apply to this little wall. If you know those, great. If not, I have done several videos on building stone walls already, and I'll put a link to the playlist up at the top of the screen here so you can go and review those principles. I'm going to assume for the rest of this video that you either have caught up on them or already know them and just go forth with this project to save time. Now, we're going to start with a stone slab. On that stone slab, we're going to build a dry laid structure. Now, as you can see, this one, there's no mortar on this one yet. I can poke it and it wiggles, but it holds together pretty well. If it won't sustain some wiggling at this stage, it won't hold together after you mortar it. Then we're going to mortar it together, and then we're going to fill on the inside with a cement mixture to make a monolith. That's where the actual strength is going to come from. Okay? At any point, even after being mortared, if you want to pick up one of these rocks and break the mortar bond, you can do it with finger pressure. Okay? It will hold together fairly well once everything is put in, cemented, the monolith is formed and is ready and done. But over time, if you lose a rock or two, just come back and epoxy it back in place. Use actual glue where you need it. First thing we need is a rock slab. This will determine the eventual size of your pot. Now you can go any size with this. The larger it is, the easier it is to build. Okay? Small walls are harder than big walls. Also, you have to remember that you're going to have a fairly substantial stone assemblage around, and you're only going to have a percentage of this for actual pot area. So in both of those regards, bigger is easier and bigger is better. To a point. If you're making this and you intend to be able to carry it around, like I'm not making these in their permanent position, you can only go so much bigger, right, before it's just unmanageable. Those two small ones are going to be on the order of 50 to 80 pounds when they're full of wet soil. This will be on the order of 150 pounds when it's full of wet soil. You don't want to go much heavier than that, or you're just not going to be able to manipulate and move your piece. If you intend to build this in its permanent position, right, if this is a rock garden and you're going to build this right where it goes in the rock garden and you're never going to move it, go ham, go big. You could also envision building this right into the top of a stone wall. Okay, again, go ham, go big. It'll be a nice piece. But if you want it to be portable, do keep that in mind, right? So once we've chosen our piece, we need to wash it. I've already said in the intro, mortar is not glue, but at the same time, we do want it to be able to grip the actual rock surface. In order for that to happen, that rock surface needs to be clean. If you have a whole bunch of schmutz on top of this, the mortar, as it forms itself and hardens into that perfectly shaped wedge, is going to be perfectly shaped to the soil that's on top of your stone. So it's gripping loose soil, not actually gripping the stone. Okay? That's not good. So we want to wash it. And then we go to the tedious step of deciding how we want to lay out our walls. Now, if you have a large flat rock, you can put some things up like this, up on edge. Okay? That's not as strong as some other configurations, but it is one you can do. Then you can lay stones flat on each other, as you would in normal walling. And once you have a surface started, you can do a sloping stone layout, something like that, right? So that's the three options of ways in which you can lay out your stones. This is the weakest. This stacked stone on, good solid surfaces with a wide base is the strongest, but it also takes up the most pot area, right? This is a much thicker intrusion into what will be the pot space, whereas this is a much lesser intrusion into that space, okay? So that's its disadvantage. It's also more difficult to get to be stable. Rocks on edge up a slope, that is the most, that's also very stable, but you have to find some nice triangular pieces to start and to stop it, like keystones, to take up that space. So if you have the rock to do that, this can be an option. And the difference between stacked partly on edge and stacked perfectly flat is somewhat just a matter of choice. Okay? Once you get this set up and it's stable enough that it holds together fairly well in and of itself, then you can go to mortaring it together. So once you have it all laid out and you know where all the pieces go, we now need to take it apart. This is where it's easy to lose track of where things are. So I'm going to take these off and set them in as close to their final orientation as possible over on this other stone. Okay. Right down through these layers. So that'll set there. That I will set there. Those can go there. Now, darn it. Now, notice that these two are not touching. That's my drainage hole for this container. Okay? You have to leave a drainage hole. This piece of stone is sloping in that direction, which is why I'm putting it here. But this will be maintained as an opening through the entire process. You can leave larger openings than that if you want to have some living wall plantings and tuck some stuff up in there. Okay? You don't have to. But this is enough that I can start the mortaring process. So I just have some commercial mortar mix. Can you see down in there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Some commercial mortar mix. This is a fairly high strength material once it's all the way cured, but it takes a couple days to build that strength. So as you're going through this, doing upper levels on the same run, and moving through the process and putting the concrete on the inside, you have to be ginger with it. That first pot over there on the far side, there's a couple spots I wasn't quite ginger enough, and I'm going to have to put a little bit more mortar in. That's okay. That looks good. So we have a relatively loose mix, but it will still hold its shape. So now as we're setting these stones, since we took the time to make sure that they fit our space very, very well, we could just use thin mortar lines. I don't care if it squeezes into the inside a little bit, but I don't want it to squeeze to the outside. You can just kind of push this around with your fingers. Take the time to form it up so we have the smallest amount of mortar doing the largest amount of work. And that'll give you a nice looking finished product. Need a little bit under this lip. Only a little bit though. There's going to be a lot more going on the inside, but this is going to be your finished surface on the outside. So take the time to do it nicely. Okay? Now, if you get a little bit of this on your stone, up until the point that it's fully hard, it will wash off with water. So if you get any streaks or stains that you don't really like, you can come in and wash them. And when this is half hard, you can come in and kind of form that in a nice looking smooth mortar lines with your fingers. When it's fully soft like this, it's a little harder to do that. Okay? So there's two stones set. This one, I have a little bit of a shim that I stuck under there as I was dry fitting it. And that's the sort of space that the mortar will take up very nicely as it hardens. And become that perfect shim. Also notice that this stone was shimmed because it wants to fall into the pot, not away from the pot. Okay. Again, watch the earlier videos I've done on dry laid stone walls. You always want things to try to lean into the earth, not out, or they'll tumble. Okay. So all of those rules apply. This is a fairly long process. I'm going to keep going, and we will rejoin when we get to the next step. So we made a bit of progress on this. I used up that first batch of mortar and got 1 course of stones mortared in. And I recommend when you're doing this that you do a course and then let it set up. Let this go for a half hour, an hour, or 2 hours. Let it firm up. It doesn't have to be all the way hard. In fact, it shouldn't be all the way hard for reasons I'll discuss in a second. But let it firm so that these aren't wiggly jiggly while you're trying to set the next rack in. Okay? That will help you. Now on for this one, there were 2 spots I needed, like I broke a couple rocks free and needed to remortar them. But that's done, and now we are going to do the inner cement monolith. So first off, my 2 drainage holes in this pot are here. Either side, these 2 rocks slope down. They have a curve underneath there, and there's a gap where water can run out. So we want to make sure that we preserve that gap. So I've taken some paper towel and some cellophane, just real simple, and just made a couple of plugs here. Kind of pinch one end and just jam it in there as good as I can. Just keep that from ever completely filling with the cement mixture we're about to use. Now, don't do this with something hard wrapped in cellophane, because unless it's absolutely perfectly smooth, and even then still you may have trouble, but unless it's absolutely perfectly smooth, the cement's going to fill in around it and grab it and lock it in place. And even though it won't adhere, you're going to have trouble pulling it out. So do something that's kind of smushy and mushy and that you can pull out in pieces if you need to at the end of the day. So the mixture that I'm going to be using is similar to some stuff people often call this hypertufa, but I'm not making true hypertufa. I'm making a cement. Cement is just aggregate and Portland cement and aggregate mixed in. Okay. The Portland cement is the material that hardens, and that is gypsum, lime, and silica. Okay. And then some aggregate to give it some structure. For aggregate, I'm using perlite. It's a puffed up material that is really light in weight. And I'm using 50-50 perlite and the Portland cement. Okay? Now this is not pre-mixed concrete. This is cement. They're different things. Pre-mixed concrete is going to have a whole bunch of big old gravel in it, and that's going to get in your way. You need a finer material. Just going to wet this, mix it up, and we want this to be a little bit stiffer than the mortar that we put on. Now the main reason that I'm using perlite in this instead of sand or gravel, I don't want large gravel because I want a fairly fine mixture, and I don't want to just use sand because it's heavy. The perlite is very, very light, so it's going to really mostly just provide airspace in here and help manage the weight of our construction. Now this is just a little bit stiffer than the mortar mixture. That's good because we need it to stay in place. And we are just going to take this and we are going to smooch it up. Got them Pennsylvania Dutch technical terms going on there. Okay. We are going
so you can schlep it.
Huh?
You gotta smooch it so you can schlep it.
No. It's already been schlepped.
Oh.
Right, I got it from up there at the house, so it's already been schlepped. Now we're smooching. Okay. Gotta get right. And this is going to form our monolith that ties all of these stones together into one unit. And if any of them pop out, this will be a solid contiguous surface to which we can glue them back. Okay. Being careful not to overly encapsulate my little plug there. Go all the way around. Now, in an ideal scenario, I did this first mortaring last night, so it's not completely the ideal scenario. It'll still be okay. But you would put this inner layer on before, darn it, you have to be careful or you'll dislodge your stones. Okay. But you would put this inner layer on before the mortar in your stones is completely hard so that they will fuse together. And the strength is in this inner layer. The stones are basically a mold for this inner layer. So it's okay, just holding it here so don't rock it out. That one I think did dislodge. It's okay if they do, because we'll just come in with epoxy later on and glue them to this inner layer after they have done their job of being a mold for it. Okay. So we'll do as much as we can with all of this mortar and all of this cement perlite, and then we will do the rest later with epoxy. And I do anticipate that the entire first row of stones is going to get epoxied after the fact. But we have to do the mortar first, let it harden to make that surface. Then we can come in and do the epoxy. Okay. This is hardening up on me really, really quick. So I'm rushing and racing. This is half Portland, which is a little bit overkill. That's okay. I don't need that piece in there. Okay. So just smooth this out a little bit. Strengthen that there a little bit more. And that is the mortar and cement mix on this completed. This one that we worked on first is finished. This one that I started to lay out finished, and you didn't see me lay out this one, but it's also finished. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, beloved, is mortar glue?
No.
No, mortar is not glue. So if I go around, any of these stones, which were just pedestaled on top, are loose. Okay? Right? Loose. Mortar is about friction and gravity. It is not about adhesion. The stones lower in that are fully embedded in the monolith that goes around the edge, those are secure. Those won't come loose unless you really whack it. Or your cat sits in it, as happened here. That wasn't part of the plan. Anyway, we'll fix it.
Schnutzy babies.
Schnutzy little buggers, I know. So the last step that we need to finish this up is to take something else and attach these to the mortar. So it turns out epoxy is glue. Okay?
Imagine that.
But what the mortar has done for us is it has made a perfectly conforming surface. I can apply the epoxy to these surfaces where the mortar is completely conforming to the stone and get very, very good adhesion. Okay, because it fits perfectly, flawlessly. That is what the mortar does for us. So I take Mr. Rock there. This is just some old random stuff that I want to use up and get rid of. So I'm going to use the rest of this tube. Okay. Mixed equal parts of epoxy like you do. Now I have my high-tech epoxy application device, and we're going to just stick some dabs of epoxy on here. Again, this is a flower pot. This is not something that we expect to take a large amount of abuse. So having a bit of epoxy in a couple different spots is all we need. And then we can take this stone. Just find where it seats. You have to get it back right where it was. There we are. And when it sits and has no wobble at all, you know it's right there against that perfectly conformal surface. Then ignore it until your epoxy sets. All of the stones that were loose are no longer loose. It's all stuck back together. Okay. For last step, we have two more stones to stick on. We have this one here and this one here. These were never mortared in. Okay. I wanted these to look loose, look like they had just slid into position here. There wasn't anything holding them there. But I don't want them to actually be loose. So for these, first I'm going to mix up, I have a little bit of a paste type epoxy. It's a lot less runny. I'm not at all concerned about brand of epoxy. It's all the same basic chemistry. The longer the hardening time, the stronger it is. But they're all the same basic chemistry beyond that. Now, I want this to be a paste type because I want to stay where I put it. I don't want it to run around and make a mess on my stones. But first I have to figure out where to put it. So I only want it just exactly on the contact points between these stones. So I'm going to nestle this in right where I want it, and then I'm just going to kind of grind it against its adjacent stone here, just so I can make a couple of little rub spots there. You can see some little rub spots here. You can see some little rub spots right on here. And now I'm just going to take a little dollop of this epoxy and just put it exactly on those little rub spots. I don't want it all over the place, and I don't want any more than necessary. First of all, it'll look odd. Second of all, it degrades. Epoxy is degraded by UV light. So now, again without smearing this around and making a mess, just gonna set that in, nestle it in nice, and don't touch it. Don't say, oh, I wonder if that's hard yet. It's gonna take an hour to fully harden. Don't touch it, okay? And then I'll do the same thing over on this one. Get this little stone in here exactly the way I want it. Wiggle it back and forth a couple times there. Wiggle it back and forth a couple times here. Okay, now I can see where my little rock dust is right here, right there. I'm going to put a little dollop of the epoxy right where all of that rock dust is and set it in place. Okay, so there we have it, here, here, and there. Make sure I have good contact. And again, it's in, it's set, it's stable, good contact with the epoxy, let it alone. Okay. Now, an hour from now, I'll come out, I'll just set a couple little plants here and I'll give you a final review. Here we go, the finished piece. It hasn't quite been a full hour since I glued those last rocks on. I'm cheating a little bit just because I have a schedule and need to get this video done. But don't do as I do. Give it time. Make sure that you have ample cure time on whatever type of epoxy you've used before you go mess around with anything. Now obviously this is not completely planted, but it gives you an idea of what this will look like when there are plants in it. Okay, and my purpose here is to make some ornamental planters with some of these lovely alpine and extremely drought tolerant plants. But this doesn't have to be an ornamental device, right? You could imagine doing this along a large, big expanse of this along the top of a stone wall and have edible stuff in it, like strawberries and dwarf aronia, right? This could be an edible planter. This could be something full of medicinal plants, right? There's a lot that you could do with this beyond just ornamentals, even though my example is ornamentals. So I look forward to planting this, and I will take you along for that journey as well in the next video. I'm also interested to see what the winter maintenance is going to look like, and all of that is going to play into some special planting techniques and some special soil preparation. So I hope that you will, of course, give this video a thumbs up. I'm very grateful when you do. It helps the algorithm know to show it to others. And I hope that if you're not subscribed, you will, so you don't miss it when we plant these beautiful planters here at Old Ways Rising Farm.